No thinness and no age after 13 years. What girls were not married in Russia? Greetings. Today, we will talk about what criteria our ancestors adhered to when they gave Russian maidens in marriage. And at the same time, we will tell in more detail what girls avoided at all. It is true that in Russia, the marriage age for the female part of the population was 13 years old, and what a maiden should have been able to do before entering into marriage. Whether well-fed girls really had a significant advantage over skinny ones, on what physical defect determined witches in Russia, and why the gate at the entrance to the house of the failed bride smeared with tar, and the guilty was forced to pass around the church on all fours. Be sure to watch the video to the very end, because so you will learn a lot of new and useful information on the topic. Early independence. Many of you know firsthand that the inhabitants of ancient Russia early enough mastered all the necessary skills of housekeeping. It is enough to remember how peasant families were organized in those times. The younger ones helped the older ones, and those, in turn, performed many duties around the house. Our ancestors adhered to the principle of equality in the family. That is why they did not divide the younger generation by gender. It is also important that Russian girls also married at a young age. For example, the marriage age for female representatives of the female sex began on average at the age of 13. And since the maidens were entering adulthood, they simply had to have a full understanding of their duties. This and cooking, and needlework, and the ability to flood the stove in the house and bring water from the well. You will probably ask, what if a girl never married before her majority? First, on the failed brides, in fact, no one of potential grooms did not pay attention. Here is appropriate phrase that has become popular, "Sasidalasya in the wench." And secondly, such a maiden by the standards of ancient Russia was considered an old woman, but she could continue to run a household and help relatives and friends. In fact, such women became housewives. Nevertheless, the main female duties remained those that are accepted in all countries and peoples of the world. As you have already guessed, it is childbearing and child-rearing. But to successfully give birth and bear a fetus, in Russia paid special attention to several important criteria. That means that not every girl could be a wife. Well, let's analyze such criteria separately, and in the end, we will make an ideal portrait of the ancient Russian bride. Physiological features. Perhaps, let's start with the appearance of Russian girls. And although the people of ancient Russia originally did not look at how a person looks in general, there were still some signs. And here they are connected with female health. And the first thing the Russian people looked at was the physique of future brides. Well-fed maidens were valued in the same way as slender girls are valued in the modern world. The reason is simple. The fact is that large in physique representatives of the female sex for the old Russian people associated with the ability to cook different dishes. But this is not all. Such maidens could safely bear a fetus and successfully give birth to a future heir. Consequently, thin and slender girls were not suitable for wives. As a rule, they were bypassed. And also, as an essential attribute of femininity, was a blush on the face and well-groomed braids. It is not for nothing that many sources constantly talk about the ruddy cheeks of Russian beauties. That is why, along with fatness, these qualities were highly valued in girls who planned to marry soon. And how without chastity, which the bride had to keep by the time of the marriage union, virginity indicated the purity of the girl, as well as her fidelity to her spouse. Otherwise, an unfaithful maiden was ridiculed by the people, dishonored by the whole family, and also had a serious conversation. As a correction for such disobedience and way of life were applied quite strict methods of punishment. We will definitely talk about them, but a little later. Social status. The status of the future bride also played a key role in the girl's life. A high position in society indicated the girl's wealth and the fact that she would not have to be poor in a difficult period. So, wealthy female representatives of the female sex also had an advantage over beggars. In most cases, a wealthy bride was chosen by men who also had a significant wealth in the family. And here, poor in material terms, girls could only count on the grooms who came from poor families. Witches in Russia. We draw your attention to the fact that witches or sorceresses were common not only in Europe. In Russia, such girls and women also had a place. But how did our ancestors determine them? To determine whether a witch in front of the Russian people or not, it was enough to look at the slouch. It is by this physical defect determined unfriendly female representatives of the female sex. And if they also in addition looked like old women, the status of witch or sorceress was determined automatically. Of course, such girls and women were not burned at the stake, as it happened in the countries of medieval Europe, but to avoid them and not to communicate with them could well. Naturally, witches in Russia were not suitable for the role of a potential bride. Severe punishments. Here we come to the last, but not unimportant question. It concerns the penalties for failed and delinquent brides. If a Russian girl could not marry, her fate was decided by relatives and acquaintances, because to leave it without attention, our ancestors simply could not. So, mainly paid attention and conducted a preventive conversation with those maidens who before marriage could not keep innocence. The fact of viciousness was determined after the first wedding night. So, if after the seclusion of newlyweds remained characteristic traces on the sheets, blood of the bride, then relatives were calm. Because from a physiological point of view, such an outcome of events indicated the virginity of the girl before the wedding. But if there were no traces at all, then the relatives and friends were immediately outraged. The unfulfilled bride was disgraced in front of all the people. Rumors about the negligent maiden spread quickly enough, and the groom in turn left the unfaithful. From that moment on, the marriage was considered null and void. But the subsequent events did not end there. As you know, wooden houses and buildings were widespread in ancient Russia. The entrance to them began, as a rule, with the gate. The latter was smeared with tar, so that all the locals knew, this is where the harlot lives, as the Russian people called girls who lost their virginity before marriage. Most of all, careless maidens were afraid of physical preventive measures. On the one hand, they could be fully punished with a whip, and often the witnesses were ordinary passers-by. Plus, the guilty girl was forced to go around the church 3 times. All would be nothing. But the girl passed such a test on all 4s. All these methods fulfilled another function, educational. And since future brides understood what awaited them in case of failure to fulfill their marital duty, they tried to keep chastity. In the end, failed brides could count either on the role of a housewife or marry a widower. Conclusion. Thus, not all old Russian girls managed to marry. Our ancestors favored mostly chaste brides, because this quality was valued above all.